Fear is the most ancient companion of a human mind. It is carved into our nervous system, an evolutionary guardian that once shielded us from predators lurking in the dark. Yet in the modern world, fear has transformed from a survival reflex into a subtle architect of limitation. It whispers in hidden corners of thought, dictating what is safe, what is possible, and what must remain untouched. Fear shapes decisions not by reason, but by contraction, by the shrinking of vision into narrow tunnels of imagined danger. In this contraction, human potential becomes imprisoned, not by external walls, but by the invisible architecture of thought itself. Freedom, by contrast, is not merely the absence of constraints, but the presence of expansion. It is the state of being where the horizon opens, where imagination dares to stretch beyond the familiar, where the self is no longer bound to the rigid patterns of past conditioning. Between these poles, fear and freedom, lies a journey that is not traveled with footsteps but with consciousness itself. This journey is what may be called the path of quantum thinking. Quantum thinking does not refer to the technical equations of physics, though it borrows its metaphors from the quantum world. It is a way of perceiving reality as fluid, probabilistic, interconnected, rather than fixed, deterministic, isolated. It is a philosophy that teaches the mind to recognize its role as both observer and creator, to transcend binary choices of safety versus danger, success versus failure, and to step into a dimension where potential unfolds in countless forms. To walk this path is to move from the paralysis of fear toward the liberation of possibility. Fear begins in certainty, the certainty of danger, of failure, of rejection. The mind imagines outcomes, projects them as inevitable, and narrows the field of possibility. Quantum thinking begins by dissolving this false certainty. It recognizes that reality is not a single fixed line, but a field of probabilities. Just as particles in quantum experiments exist in superposition until observed, the future exists in multiplicity until chosen. To accept this is to see that fear itself is a form of premature collapse, a narrowing of infinite paths into one bleak inevitability. When one learns to withhold judgment, to stay in the openness of possibility, fear begins to lose its grip. Consider the architecture of thought as a wave function. In a state of fear, the wave function collapses toward the lowest energy solution, the most contracted possibility. It is the thought equivalent of curling into a defensive posture. But quantum thinking invites the wave to remain in its fullness, to entertain multiple futures without attachment, to choose deliberately rather than react reflexively. This deliberate choice is the seed of freedom. Yet freedom is not found in reckless denial of fear. To walk this path requires first the courage to look directly at fear without judgment. Fear thrives in shadows, feeding on avoidance. When brought into awareness, fear reveals itself as energy, a signal of uncertainty rather than a prophecy of doom. The quantum thinker does not resist this energy, but reinterprets it. Instead of fear means danger, the reinterpretation becomes fear means possibility I have not yet mastered. This shift transforms fear from a chain into a compass, pointing not to what must be avoided, but to where growth resides. To illustrate, imagine the fear of speaking before an audience. In classical thinking, fear is taken as evidence of incompetence or impending failure, and the individual retreats. In quantum thinking, fear is evidence of entering a probability field beyond current comfort. Instead of collapse, one remains open. The fear is not a sentence, but a signpost. Within this openness lies the freedom to choose. Will the individual embody the path of contraction or step into the expanded path of expression? The choice itself, not the fear, shapes reality. Walking this path requires practices of awareness that anchor the mind in quantum possibility. Meditation, breath, mindfulness. These are not mere spiritual ornaments, but disciplines that slow the collapse of thought into reflexive fear. They allow space between stimulus and response, a space in which possibility is preserved. In that space, freedom germinates. But freedom, in the quantum sense, is not only personal. The interconnection of all things suggests that individual thought does not exist in isolation. Each choice reverberates across a wider field of relationships, environments, and even collective consciousness. Fear contracts not only the individual, but the collective field. Freedom expands both. When one human being transcends fear through quantum thinking, the ripple of that freedom extends beyond the self, influencing others subtly, invisibly, like resonance across a web of strings. This is why walking the path of quantum thinking is not escapism, but responsibility. To think in fear is to seed limitation into the collective. To think in freedom is to seed expansion. The mind, then, becomes not only the theater of personal liberation, but the laboratory of collective evolution. Fear imprisons humanity into cycles of conflict, prejudice, and scarcity. Freedom, when lived through quantum thinking, begins to dissolve these cycles by reintroducing multiplicity where once there was false certainty. The paradox is that freedom is not achieved by force, but by surrendering the illusion that one must control every outcome, that safety lies in prediction. The quantum world itself shows us that uncertainty is not chaos, but the very fabric of creation. To embrace uncertainty is to stand in alignment with reality itself. In this alignment, the mind no longer wages war against what it cannot control, but dances with it. Fear loses its foundation when uncertainty is welcomed as ally rather than enemy. This surrender does not make life passive. On the contrary, it ignites creativity. The one who no longer fears uncertainty is free to imagine, to experiment, to innovate. Without the burden of needing guarantees, life becomes a canvas of exploration. Every decision is not a desperate bid for survival, but a brushstroke on an infinite painting. In this way, freedom is not the elimination of boundaries, but the recognition that boundaries themselves are fluid, permeable, subject to reinterpretation. The path is walked not in dramatic leaps, but in small, deliberate choices. Each time fear whispers its prophecy of doom, and the mind pauses, observes, reinterprets, and chooses differently, the path is deepened. Over time, the neural patterns of contraction weaken, replaced by patterns of expansion. Neuroscience itself confirms this. Repeated choices form circuits, and circuits become tendencies. Quantum thinking is thus not abstract philosophy, but embodied practice, rewiring the very architecture of the brain toward freedom. Still, the greatest barrier on this path is the illusion of separation, the belief that the self is isolated, vulnerable, at odds with a hostile universe. Fear thrives in this illusion, for if the self is separate, then safety must be hoarded, control must be grasped, and freedom seems perilous. Quantum thinking dissolves this illusion by revealing interconnectedness. Just as entangled particles remain linked across space, so too is consciousness woven into the fabric of existence. To recognize this is to understand that one is not walking alone, but as part of a vast, intelligent whole. In such recognition, fear softens, for how can one be lost when one is inseparable from the whole? To walk from fear to freedom is therefore to shift identity itself, from the small self clinging to survival, to the expansive self that recognizes its role as co-creator. This is not a conceptual shift, but an existential one. It changes how the individual perceives challenge, how they engage with others, how they imagine the future. The fearful self asks, "What if I fail?" The quantum self asks, "What is possible now?" The fearful self contracts in uncertainty. The quantum self expands. This expansion redefines power. In fear, power is control, domination over circumstances, others, or even oneself. In freedom, power is alignment, moving with the current of possibility rather than against it. Just as a sailor cannot control the wind, but can align the sails, the quantum thinker does not command reality, but collaborates with it. This collaboration turns life from struggle into flow. Where fear sees only obstacles, freedom sees currents. The final step on this path is love. Not sentimental affection, but the recognition of unity expressed as care. Love is the natural expression of freedom, for when the self is no longer imprisoned by fear, it no longer needs to defend, to hoard, to harm. Love becomes not a moral demand, but a spontaneous overflow of alignment with the interconnected whole. Fear divides, love unites. Fear contracts, love expands. Fear imprisons, love liberates. Walking the path of quantum thinking, one arrives at love not as doctrine, but as inevitability. Freedom is not an end state, but a continual unfolding. To think quantumly is to remain in dialogue with the infinite, to recognize that every moment contains new possibilities waiting to be chosen. Fear will arise, is part of the human condition, but freedom is the art of meeting fear without collapse, of reinterpreting it again and again. The path is walked not once, but continuously, in every thought, every decision, every encounter. This continuity is crucial, for fear often disguises itself in subtler forms. It masquerades as caution, as rationality, as tradition. It hides behind the familiar voice that says, "This is how it has always been," or "People like you don't do things like that." These disguises are perhaps more dangerous than overt terror, for they weave themselves into the fabric of identity. Quantum thinking exposes these disguises by asking a simple question. Is this thought expanding possibility or collapsing it? If it collapses, it is fear. If it expands, it is freedom. This question becomes a compass for living. In relationships, does one collapse into old patterns of defensiveness or expand into new ways of listening? In creativity, does one collapse into imitation or expand into originality? In society, does one collapse into prejudice or expand into empathy? Each moment becomes an invitation to choose expansion over contraction, freedom over fear. Quantum thinking also demands humility, for it acknowledges that the field of possibility is larger than any one mind can grasp. This humility prevents freedom from becoming arrogance. It reminds the thinker that every choice contributes to the whole, and therefore carries responsibility. Freedom is not license to impose, but the ability to align responsibly with the greater flow of reality. The path of quantum thinking, therefore, leads not to isolated liberation, but to collective transformation. As more individuals walk it, the field itself begins to shift. A culture that values expansion over contraction, possibility over fear, becomes fertile ground for innovation, cooperation, and peace. This is not utopia, but evolution, the natural unfolding when fear no longer dominates thought. The greatest revolutions in history have not been revolutions of force, but of perception. When paradigms shift, entire civilizations change course. Quantum thinking offers such a shift, not through politics or technology alone, but through the transformation of the very lens through which humans see reality. It invites humanity to move beyond the binary prison of fear and into the multidimensional freedom of possibility. Walking this path is both ancient and new. Ancient, because mystics and sages have long spoken of dissolving fear, of embracing unity, of living in love. New, because science itself now provides metaphors and insights that make these truths intelligible to the modern mind. The language of waves, probabilities, and entanglement offers a bridge between wisdom and reason, between intuition and intellect. This bridge is where quantum thinking stands, a meeting place of science and spirit, of logic and imagination. Ultimately, the path is not walked by the exceptional few, but by anyone willing to question the authority of fear. It does not require advanced knowledge, but simple presence. To pause before collapsing into contraction, to breathe before reacting, To choose expansion when fear urges retreat. These are the steps. Over time, they weave a life of freedom, not as fantasy, but as lived reality. From fear to freedom is not merely a journey of survival, but of awakening. It is the awakening of consciousness to its own power, its own interconnectedness, its own creativity. Quantum thinking is the map, but the walker is each individual. Every moment presents the fork, contraction or expansion, fear or freedom. To choose freedom is to step into alignment with the infinite, to live not as prisoner, but as creator, not as victim, but as participant in the unfolding cosmos. And so the path continues, infinite, unending, alive with possibility, waiting only for the next choice, the next thought, the next step into freedom.